Hello guys, I'm Tom, and today we'll take a look at who Leatherface is. One of the most fascinating, complex, and terrifying characters in horror cinema is undoubtedly Leatherface, the iconic killer from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre saga. Over the decades, he has been portrayed in various ways, from a brutal and ruthless monster to a victim of abuse and neglect. His presence is unmistakable, not only because of his grotesque mask made of human skin, but also due to his ability to instill fear with his chainsaw, a weapon that has become a symbol of terror. However, behind his violence and monstrosity, Leatherface is a character marked by trauma, emotional weaknesses, and a deeply fragmented identity, which makes him a tragic and fascinating figure. That's why in this video, I will explain in detail the history and origins of Leatherface. For that, I'll give you a summary of his story across different films and comics, then talk about his physical appearance, personality, and his incredible abilities and known weaknesses. The story begins in 1939 with the revelation of the horrible and tragic childhood of Thomas Hewitt. In this opening, we are introduced to a very young mother who gives birth to a child under extreme circumstances. Her baby is born dead, but due to the family's desperation and poverty, the mother decides to keep the baby despite being unable to provide the necessary care. The child is not entirely dead, and he is taken by his mother to a town where he grows up without receiving proper love or basic education. Since his childhood, Thomas is treated cruelly and dismissively by his mother and aunt. His mother, portrayed as a tough and cold woman, denies him the affection necessary for his emotional development. Instead of being treated like a normal child, he is relegated to the silence and darkness of the family farm, isolated from society. Thomas grows up under constant repression, without the opportunity to interact normally with other children. His aunt, equally abusive, sees him as a shame to the family and mocks him, feeding the feeling of being an outcast. During his adolescence, we see how Thomas becomes a misunderstood and emotionally disturbed being. His distorted view of the world is influenced by the constant violence of his family environment, where shouting, fighting, and physical and psychological abuse become his only reality. One of the most important scenes in the movie is when Thomas, now a teenager, faces the death of his mother. In a burst of rage and desperation, he begins to cut the skin of the victims he finds around him to create a sort of mask. This is the turning point when, for the first time, the figure of Leatherface starts to take shape. The mask he creates is not just a way to conceal his face, but a way to create a completely new identity. This transformation of Thomas into Leatherface is not only physical, but also psychological, as he starts taking the lives of others as a way to manifest his hatred toward the world and his own family. The story also explores how Leatherface becomes integrated into the Hewitt family. In the beginning, Thomas's family is presented as a dysfunctional and terrifying unit. The Hewitts are a family of cannibals who live in the shadows, outside the bounds of society. As Leatherface becomes a threat, he becomes more integrated into the rest of the family, who support him in his atrocious acts. Within this clan, Leatherface is not just a solitary killer. He is part of a family machinery where the roles of each member intertwine in a macabre way. From the father, who represents the figure of authority within the family, to the brother, who shares his inclination toward violence, Leatherface becomes a key piece in the dynamic of the Hewitt family. The family members see themselves as outside the legal and social systems, surviving by kidnapping and killing unsuspecting travelers who cross their territory. Throughout the film, Thomas's transformation into Leatherface is depicted as a gradual dehumanization. His lack of identity, combined with the abuse and violence, pushes him to become a monster who sees the suffering of others as a way to satisfy his own internal pain. The film shows how society and family, rather than helping him, shape him into a being who cannot escape his destructive nature. The figure of Leatherface is not presented as an evil entity by choice, but as a victim of his environment, someone whose identity has been forged by abuse and cruelty, turning him into a being who knows neither love nor compassion. As the movie progresses, Thomas, now in his Leatherface form, begins to show the traits that will define him in later installments. The use of the mask, his way of operating with a chainsaw, and his relationship with the family are key elements that are developed here. However, the beginning also humanizes the character, allowing the viewer to see the violence and madness in a more empathetic way, as a direct result of a family and social system that has catastrophically failed. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The beginning not only explores the origins of Leatherface, but also establishes a more complex narrative about the family and the psyche of the character. Unlike other installments in the saga, which present Leatherface as a purely monstrous figure, this film delves into his roots, suggesting that his brutality is a direct consequence of the horrific circumstances he has endured. In contrast to the prequel The Beginning, 2006, which explores his youth and the family environment that shapes him, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre presents an adult Leatherface, a large and burly man whose identity is deeply marked by his past. In this film, Leatherface is one of the most prominent members of a dysfunctional family, whose violent and cannibalistic behavior is a well-kept secret, hidden in the shadows of their isolated farm. Leatherface is not presented here as a conscious villain or a killer motivated by hatred or sadistic pleasure. Rather, he appears to be a victim of his environment. To a large extent, his violent nature is due to the influence of his family, who manipulates and uses him as a tool to carry out their atrocious crimes. Although he is the most visible face and the most active killer, Leatherface seems to be just one piece in a larger machine, a machine of familial madness that conditions him to act the way he does. Leatherface's family is made up of equally disturbing and dehumanized characters. The central figure is the patriarch, the grandfather, who seems to be a dominant presence in the family, despite being practically inert for most of the film. In addition, the family consists of Leatherface's brother, the head of the family Moore Hunter, who acts as an accomplice and guide to Leatherface in his murders. The family dynamic is completely broken, and the treatment of Leatherface by the other family members reinforces the idea that he is more of a victim than a villain. Leatherface, like his relatives, has been shaped by years of abuse, abandonment, and an extreme environment of violence. Throughout the film, it is suggested that he is not fully aware of the gravity of his actions. This is reflected in his erratic behavior and his inability to understand the consequences of his crimes. For example, Leatherface uses the mask, which he creates from the skin of his victims, not only to conceal his face, but also as a way of finding an identity in a world that never accepted or understood him. The mask is a visual metaphor for being stripped of his humanity and the creation of an identity imposed by circumstances. Regarding his physical and psychological characterization, Leatherface is praised for his imposing presence and grotesque appearance. With his enormous size and his clumsy way of moving, a monstrous figure is created, one that resembles more of a force of nature than a rational human being. His chainsaw, which he uses brutally and uncontrollably, becomes his main tool, but also a symbol of his animal instincts and the dehumanized nature of his actions. Throughout the film, Leatherface is a primitive being who seems to react primarily to immediate stimuli without meticulous planning. He is shown in constant struggle, trying to find a balance between his desire to meet his family's expectations and his own fear and discomfort about what he is doing. At several points, Leatherface appears confused, even frightened, making him a much more complex figure than just a simple villain chasing victims. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, Leatherface finds himself at a point in his life where the violence and madness of his family have led him to a more complex emotional state. Compared to the original film, where his nature was more instinctive and a product of his environment, here he is shown to be more aware of his role in the world, yet still trapped by the expectations and rules of the Hewitt family. Leatherface, now an adult with a more refined mask, has evolved from being a simple victim of his family to a key player within it. Despite his continued murders, he remains a tragic figure, The isolation of the farm has gradually begun to fade, and society starts to realize the horrors that the Hewitt family has been carrying out in anonymity, resulting in increased public and police attention. Leatherface's relationship with the members of his family is further explored in this sequel. The character remains the same man who, in the original film, is manipulated by his family, but in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, the dynamics within his home are more deeply examined. His mother, who has probably died between the events of both films, leaves a void that is filled by the rest of the family, including his brother Chop Top, who adds an additional layer of madness to the family chaos. In this sequel, Leatherface remains the executor of the family's crimes. He is not completely autonomous, but his role as the hunter is intensified. He is often shown in a highly emotional state, sometimes altered by interactions with his brother, and other times vulnerable to the comments and expectations of his family. There are moments of absolute chaos where Leatherface seems unsure of how to act, mixing his violence with moments of confusion and even insecurity, which humanizes the character further. Although the film has a more satirical and black comedy tone, Leatherface's insecurity remains a central theme. Throughout Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, it is clear that his role as a serial killer is not something he fully accepts. In moments of solitude, he seems more like a big child than a monster, struggling with his family's legacy and the violence he has been forced to commit. He appears tense and uncontrollable in the situations he faces, often reacting in an exaggerated manner, which contributes to the black humor that characterizes the film. A clear example of this is his relationship with Stretch, one of the victims who survives his attacks. While in the first film, Leatherface chases his victims without any remorse or emotional motive, in this sequel, his behavior towards Stretch is more complex. Although still a terrifying figure, he seems to seek a connection with her, reflecting his own loneliness and confusion. The interaction between Leatherface and Stretch becomes an emotional tug-of-war, in which he seems to desire both his family's approval and a minimum of human understanding. The black comedy tone of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 makes Leatherface's violence and madness appear in an exaggerated manner, but this also reinforces the idea that his dehumanization is total. His violence, although still brutal, is mixed with absurd scenes, such as when he uses a chainsaw in situations that become almost ridiculous due to how implausible they are. In this sense, the film moves between horror and black comedy, using the contrast to show Leatherface's disconnection from the reality around him. For example, in a memorable scene, Leatherface is in an emotional crisis, confronting his own nature and the chaos of his family environment. While carrying out a massacre in which he seems to have no control, the violent sequences are mixed with moments of confusion and a touch of absurd comedy, giving the film and Leatherface's character a tragicomic air. The violence is not only seen as a means to gain power, but also as an escape from the constant alienation and violence he lives within his family. In this sequel, society begins to pay attention to the atrocities committed by the Hewitt family. Although Leatherface is aware that he is being pursued by the authorities, he and his family continue with their murders in an almost defiant manner. In his mind, the connection with his family and keeping the business running is more important than any attempt to escape from the police. Here, Leatherface begins to be more aware of his role in an outside world that is starting to take notice of him, which becomes a central element of his anguish and emotional struggle. However, despite his efforts, the cycle of violence remains his inevitable fate. The presence of authority figures and normal people who cross his path becomes a constant reminder that Leatherface is a monster in a world that neither accepts nor understands him. Unlike Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning, 2006, where we are introduced to a young Thomas Hewitt, just before he becomes the feared killer known as Leatherface, 2017, delves deeper into Thomas Hewitt's adolescent years, showing his transformation from a more innocent and confused young man into the monster he will become. Here, Thomas is not simply a product of his environment, the film explores the specific influence of his family and surroundings. We see how his identity is shaped throughout his adolescence, and his internal struggles are revealed as he tries to adapt to a life of violence. The film also introduces more elements of psychological trauma and the attempt to fit into a dysfunctional family, giving a deeper dimension to his creation as Leatherface. Both films explore Leatherface's creation from an abusive childhood, but while the beginning focuses more on Thomas's lack of options to escape his fate, Leatherface takes a more nuanced approach to his adolescence, showing his attempt to find his identity and deal with internal confusion. The 2017 film explores a more complex aspect of Thomas's relationship with his family. In his adolescence, the pressure from his family remains enormous, but in this version, we see that Thomas is not just a blind follower. The film introduces his mother and other family members, but it also gives more voice to his emotions and conflicts. Throughout his transformation, Thomas begins to develop a sense of self, although he is still trapped in the expectations his family has for him. Leatherface 2017 also shows violence as a catalyst for Thomas's transformation, but with a more complex approach. Young Thomas is more sensitive, which makes the impact of violence even deeper. Rather than being simply a product of his environment, Thomas is driven by an internal struggle, a mix of rejection, fear, and confusion that leads him to adopt violence as a way to adapt and gain his family's approval. The violence in Leatherface is not just the result of his abuse, but also of a personal search for identity and belonging. In Leatherface, the creation of the mask is more symbolic. Here, the mask is not just a tool to hide his face, but also a symbol of his internal struggle. Thomas adopts the mask as part of his transformation and acceptance within his family, but it is also an attempt to find his identity amidst the chaos surrounding him. The mask becomes a visual representation of his loss of humanity, but also of his desperate need to fit in. Both films use the mask as a means to show Thomas's transformation into Leatherface, but Leatherface delves deeper into the symbolism of the mask as a reflection of his fractured identity. While in the beginning, the mask is presented more as a tool for dehumanization and conformity to family expectations. Leatherface is a film that focuses on character development, showing a Thomas Hewitt who, although heavily influenced by his family, struggles with his identity. As the film progresses, we see how his relationship with violence and his family leads him to become the Leatherface we know, but with a greater emotional and psychological burden. While the beginning shows a more defined Leatherface as a killer due to the circumstances of his life, Leatherface focuses on the internal process of his transformation, showing Thomas's struggle to find his place in a world that doesn't understand him. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D follows a different timeline from the previous installments of the saga, but is directly connected to the original 1974 film, picking up the story right where it left off. In this film, Leatherface is already an adult, much more savage and disturbing than in his earlier appearances. The story centers around a young woman named Heather, who discovers that she is Leatherface's niece, the heir to the Hewitt family fortune, and must face the consequences of her connection to a man whose existence is marked by horror and violence. From Leatherface's perspective, this film emphasizes a character who is already well established and, although it does not focus on his origins, remains central to the story. Now Leatherface is a mature man, hardened by years of suffering and violence. Here, we do not see the process of his creation as in the previous prequels, but instead, we find him at an advanced point in his life, an unstoppable killer who has perfected his role in the Hewitt family. It is important to note that the film does not delve into his psychology or origins, but it maintains a constant sense of terror when we see a man who continues to act on impulse, guided by a life of brutality that knows no other way of existence. From Leatherface's perspective, this film shows an individual who has been deeply marked by his environment and the systematic violence he has suffered throughout his life. The character does not pause to question himself, he simply acts. The idea of family remains key in this version, but now Leatherface is almost a force of nature, an unstoppable monster who operates without compassion. Here, family is no longer just a factor of his identity. It has become the engine of his violence. The bond with his niece, though unwelcome, is not enough to stop his brutal behavior. In this film, Leatherface is forced to interact with his family, specifically with his niece Heather. Throughout the movie, it is revealed that Heather is the heir to the Hewitt family fortune, a revelation that puts Leatherface in conflict with the other characters, but also provides perspective on his relationship with the family. Family in this installment is not only about blood relations, but also about legacy, survival, and revenge. For Leatherface, Heather's arrival is more of an opportunity to continue his violent legacy than an attempt to connect with family. Throughout the film, he persists in his role as a monster, showing no clear signs of regret or desire for reconciliation, which emphasizes how violence and brutality are an integral part of his being. From Leatherface's perspective, Heather's arrival does not bring redemption or a change in his behavior. On the contrary, the only thing that seems to matter is maintaining power within the family, which drives him to pursue her with even more fierceness. This dynamic introduces a more pragmatic view of family, where blood ties are nothing more than an excuse to continue the cycle of violence. For Leatherface, Heather is just a piece in his chaotic, wild world, a reminder of what was taken from him and what he is willing to protect at all costs: control over his world and his family through violence. Unlike previous versions of Leatherface, which showed some remnants of his humanity, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D presents a character much more savage and uncontrollable. Throughout the film, Leatherface does not seek excuses or justifications for his actions. He simply acts. This version of Leatherface is more an animal than a man, and his need for violence seems driven more by a visceral reaction than by rational thought. What defines him is not his past, but his present. A present where there is no room for reflection, only for extermination and destruction. Now, Leatherface is almost a specter, a manifestation of evil incarnate in the figure of a broken man. There is no space for empathy or compassion, and this is reflected in his relentless actions. The film emphasizes how violence remains his only mode of existence, with no truce or introspection. One of the most emblematic elements of Leatherface is his mask, and in 3D, it remains a crucial symbol of his identity. Leatherface's mask is not just a tool to hide his face, but a means to establish control and dominance. Just as in previous installments, the mask is a way for Leatherface to strip away any remnants of humanity and become the monstrous figure that his family has raised. However, in this film, the mask not only represents his dehumanization, but also his total rejection of any emotional or affectionate connection. For him, the mask is the only thing that keeps him connected to his purpose: to be an instrument of terror. One of the most interesting aspects of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D is the way it presents the conflict with society at large. Throughout the film, Leatherface faces law enforcement and a society that no longer accommodates him. Although this film is presented as a return to unrestricted violence, it also offers a glimpse of the idea that Leatherface is a creature out of place in modern society. Throughout the film, Leatherface is a displaced figure, a monster who no longer finds his place in a world that has changed. And in his confrontation with Heather, it is questioned whether there is any possibility of redemption for him. However, Leatherface never seems to seek redemption, and in fact, his behavior seems to affirm his unchanging nature. In his mind, violence is simply an extension of his identity, and there is no room for empathy or transformation. In 3D, Leatherface remains a killing machine with no place in society, but his story also reflects how family and legacy can bind him to a cycle of endless violence. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D, Leatherface is no longer the disturbed young man we saw in the prequels. He is a hardened man whose existence is completely defined by violence and the need to maintain control within the Hewitt family. Although the film does not delve into his origins, it still presents Leatherface as a character whose humanity has been stripped away and replaced by perpetual monstrosity. The relationship with his niece Heather introduces the idea of inheritance and legacy, but for Leatherface, this only represents a new opportunity to continue the cycle of horror and destruction. Throughout the film, Leatherface remains a wild and uncompassionate figure, trapped in a world of violence from which he cannot escape, not because he doesn't want to, but because it is the only thing he knows how to do. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 2022, presents an aging Leatherface, but with a resilience and fury that have not diminished with the years. Although his origins are not explored in depth, the film makes it clear that the character remains a terrifying figure, though no longer as agile as in his younger days. Leatherface has stayed away from the world, living in isolation in an abandoned house, until a new group of young people invades his territory and triggers him once again. Through his eyes, the film conveys the feeling of a monster who has been forgotten but still stands, waiting for the moment to rise again with all his violence. Leatherface's return is not just a physical return, but also a return to his most primitive essence: violence, fear, and brutality. Despite his age, Leatherface remains an unstoppable killer, and the film reminds us that it is not just his body that has changed, but his persistent thirst for revenge. No longer needing to protect his family, his revenge becomes something more personal, a desire to preserve what is left of his world and reaffirm his dominance over the territory he once ruled. From Leatherface's perspective, this film offers a version of the character where violence and death are still his only form of interaction with the world. The arrival of new characters does not move him toward redemption or regret. On the contrary, the presence of these young intruders simply acts as a spark that ignites his rage accumulated over the years. For him, time has passed, but the hate that defines him remains intact, and his response is a series of killings that reflect his return to action with no justification or introspection. The film makes it clear that for Leatherface, violence is timeless, a cycle that does not end simply because he has gotten older. What stands out in this installment is how the incapacity of society and the young characters to understand the true extent of the evil represented by figures like Leatherface is portrayed. The new characters, unaware of the horror legacy of the Hewitt family, try to confront a Leatherface who seems like a specter from the past but remains just as deadly. Through Leatherface's perspective, we can see how time has passed, but the monster remains the same. The pain and suffering that defined him in his youth still guide him, but he no longer needs the support of his family to continue his path of terror. He is a monster that has survived time, spent years in the dark, but remains intact in his essence. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022, Leatherface is not only presented as an aging being, but as a monster who has had time to perfect his macabre art. Throughout the film, he is shown as a more calculating character, less erratic than in his earlier incarnations, and moves with an unsettling precision. The scene where he uses his chainsaw is as brutal as in previous films, but now there is a coldness and efficiency in his movements. The decay of his physique does not mean he has lost his abilities. On the contrary, his experience makes him a more dangerous and cunning enemy. For Leatherface, the chainsaw is not just an instrument of death, but an extension of himself, a symbol of his enduring monstrosity. In this installment, it is reaffirmed that his violence is impersonal. It is not a thirst for direct revenge or an emotional connection with his victims, but an almost instinctual need to destroy everything in his path. Although the character's origins are not delved into in this film, the family trauma remains a crucial part of what Leatherface represents. Throughout the saga, his relationship with the Hewitt family has been complex, both as a victim and as a perpetrator, but in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022, this bond seems more like a shadow of the past. However, The film still presents Leatherface as a product of family abuse and violence. Through his return, the film reflects how traumas do not disappear with time, but remain, waiting to be unleashed again, and Leatherface is the symbol of that violent release. Leatherface's return is not just a physical return, but also an emotional one, as he reconnects with the suffering and violence that have marked his life from the beginning. Despite his age, family remains his driving force, although this time his motivation seems more about his desire to maintain control over his world than about a direct bond with his relatives. In his mind, family is his to dominate and destroy, and that does not change with time. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre comic series has been a fundamental part of Leatherface's universe and his story. It not only revisits the events of the films, but also expands the franchise's universe by introducing new characters, situations, and, of course, new victims. Throughout various issues, Leatherface's character has been reinterpreted, yet certain fundamental elements, such as his brutality, lack of empathy, and his belonging to the Hewitt family, remain consistent, although some comics present variations of the events seen in the films. In several comics, Leatherface is portrayed as a character who is not only an unstoppable killer, but also an individual trapped in a cycle of family violence and personal suffering. This version of Leatherface occasionally reveals more of his inner thoughts and emotions, allowing us to gain a more complex perspective on the monster we know from the films. Although his origins are not always fully explored, some comics delve into his formative years, the impact of his abusive upbringing, and how his psyche distorts over time. Others focus on the fact that Leatherface is yet another victim of his environment, though this victimization has transformed him into a being capable of unimaginable acts. One of the most interesting aspects of the comics is how they present Leatherface from a more introspective perspective, especially in his moments of internal struggle. In some stories, the character is seen as a victim trapped in a spiral of horror, unable to escape the monster he has become. This approach allows for the exploration of the more human aspects of the character, even when his behavior remains ruthless. The stories tend to highlight Leatherface's internal contradiction, a man unable to escape his monstrous nature, but who occasionally struggles with the weight of what he is. In particular, some comics suggest that the violence Leatherface carries out is not solely the result of his genetics or an inherent desire for destruction, but also due to the emotional and psychological damage suffered throughout his life. This humanizes the character to some extent, although he is not portrayed as a victim in the traditional sense, since, despite being shaped by abuse and trauma, he never seeks redemption. The comics add an extra layer of complexity to his psychology, showcasing the tension between his murderous impulses and the remnants of humanity that may still exist within him. The Hewitt family is central to Leatherface's story, and several comics explore the family dynamics in greater detail. While the films focus more on the family as a group of cannibals and psychopaths, the comics have the opportunity to expand the story by delving deeper into the interpersonal relationships within the family and the impact it has on the young Thomas Hewitt. Through the comics, we can see how the members of the Hewitt family reinforce Leatherface's violent nature and how these family ties are deeply intertwined with the horror Leatherface creates. In some comics, the figure of Leatherface's mother plays an even more dominant role in the creation of his monstrosity, showing her as a woman who not only abused him, but also fueled his hatred for the outside world, training him to be a killer. In this way, the comics allow for a reinterpretation of the family that goes beyond the established norms of the films, providing additional details about the cycle of violence that perpetuates Leatherface. Unlike the films, which often follow a fairly defined chronology, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre comics do not always maintain a consistent timeline. Some comics follow events directly related to the films, while others create parallel stories or significantly alter the course of events. This allows for greater creative freedom, but may also confuse fans who expect a direct continuation of the cinematic plots. However, this approach also gives the comics an air of mystery and flexibility, Writers can explore different aspects of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre universe without being bound by the rules and continuity established by the films. This makes some comics feel like a freer extension of Leatherface's world, where events can be reinterpreted and the rules can be modified to tell new stories. Some of the most popular comics, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the Grindhouse, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Day of the Dead, for example, present alternative stories that explore what might have happened if certain events in the films had been resolved differently. In these comics, Leatherface and his family are confronted with new threats, reinforcing their role as a force of evil that remains relevant in a world larger than the original films. The comics depict a Leatherface who, despite the different interpretations, remains a central symbol of violence and terror. In the films, Leatherface is a representation of inhuman brutality, but in the comics, more complex aspects of his identity are explored, making the character seem both a victim and an executioner. However, no matter how many additional details the comics offer about his life, the message remains the same. Leatherface is a monster, a figure shaped by his environment who, although having glimpses of humanity, is trapped in an endless cycle of horror. Throughout the comics, Leatherface remains that unchanging figure, sometimes showing signs of distress or remorse, but always returning to violence, a fate he cannot escape. This constant reaffirmation of his monstrosity makes Leatherface, despite his evolution in the comics, remain an icon of horror, reminding readers that violence, fear, and suffering are forces that can always return. And now that we've covered his history in depth, I want to talk to you about Leatherface's physical appearance, what we know about his personality and behavior, and I'll explain his incredible abilities and known weaknesses. One of the most notable features of Leatherface is his mask, which is not just a simple mask, but human skin stripped from his victims. Throughout the films, Leatherface changes masks depending on his emotional state or what he is trying to represent, which becomes a form of identity change. The masks reflect his attempt to assume different identities, often those of his victims, as a way to hide his true self and protect himself from humiliation or rejection. The masks vary in design, but they all share a grotesque and disturbing appearance. They are skins from disfigured people, with hollow eyes, mouths open in macabre grimaces, and tangled hair, representing both Leatherface's brutality and his attempt to create an identity that hides and defines him. The mask is, in many ways, an extension of his trauma and his need to find a place where he belongs. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, 1986, Leatherface uses a smiling woman's mask, reflecting his desire to portray a more feminine and traditional figure. This mask change adds another layer of complexity to his personality. He is searching for something with which he can identify or that represents a form of normalcy he has never known. Leatherface is a large man, typically portrayed as tall and bulky, with a muscular build that allows him to physically confront his victims with brute strength. His robust physique not only enables him to carry out extreme acts of violence, but also makes him an imposing and terrifying figure. In the films, especially in the more recent ones, Leatherface is shown as a man of great physical strength, capable of easily carrying his chainsaw and other tools, demonstrating his dominance over his environment. His muscle mass and height contribute to his intimidating presence, heightening the vulnerability of victims who try to escape his reach. Leatherface is a deformed figure, one of the characteristics that most distinguishes him from other horror movie villains. His face and body reflect the abuse and neglect he suffered throughout his life. In some films, such as the prequels, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Beginning, and Leatherface, it is revealed that his deformity is the result of a combination of genetics and abuse by his family, who subjected him to an extremely violent and dehumanized environment. His face, usually covered by the mask, sometimes shows scars, wounds, or malformations, hinting at his physical trauma. In Leatherface, 2017, the film explores his youth and how his physical and emotional wounds turn him into what he is, a monster shaped by both abuse and the visible scars that adorn his body. In some versions, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D, 2013, Leatherface appears more mature, although his body still bears the traits of a deformed person, reinforcing the idea that his wounds and physical deformities are an intrinsic part of his identity. In many of the films, Leatherface is portrayed as dirty and disheveled. His clothes, usually torn and stained with blood, reflect the environment in which his life unfolds, in a primitive, chaotic, and violent setting. In some installments, he wears a butcher's apron covered in blood and human remains, reinforcing his role as the hunter and executor of his own macabre justice. Leatherface's body, dirty and decomposing, is in sync with the violence he commits. This image is designed to make the character even more disturbing, as the filth and blood not only represent his monstrosity, but also the rawness of his life, where human waste and brutality are the norm. The chainsaw is another essential aspect of Leatherface's appearance, not only as a lethal weapon, but also as an extension of his personality and identity. He is often seen wielding the chainsaw with both hands, emphasizing his desire to inflict massive physical damage on his victims. The chainsaw is not only a tool of death, but also a symbol of his monstrosity, the need to tear and destroy, often in a brutal and merciless way. Throughout the films, the chainsaw becomes an extension of Leatherface, an object with which he feels almost symbiotically connected. The way he wields and uses it reflects both his brutality and his inability to interact in a normal way with the world around him. In some versions of the saga, Leatherface's appearance is handled ambiguously, portraying him as a being almost out of place in the world. The deformity is not only in his face, but also in his psychology and actions. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3D, 2013, for example, Leatherface is shown as much more dehumanized, almost like a beast, while in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the beginning 2006, his face and body more clearly display the scars of his suffering and abuse, making him a figure that inspires both revulsion and some degree of pity. The ambiguity in his appearance underscores the complexity of the character. Despite being a monster, he is also a human being with the appearance and characteristics of someone molded by the brutality of his environment. The deformity is not only physical, but also emotional and psychological. Leatherface is a character whose emotions and thoughts are extremely complex. Despite being a killer, there are moments when an internal struggle over his identity and what he represents becomes evident. The human skin mask he wears is a symbol of this fragmented identity. By wearing the faces of his victims, Leatherface seeks, in a psychological sense, to assume an identity that is not his own, as his own sense of self is distorted. The masks represent his attempt to fit in or transform into something he is not, reflecting his confusion and desperation to find a place in the world. In some comics and films, Leatherface displays deep vulnerability when deprived of his mask, symbolizing the loss of the only identity that gives him meaning. His constant change of masks also reflects his inability to maintain a stable and coherent identity, something that, on a psychological level, could be explained by the extreme abuse and dehumanization he experienced. One of Leatherface's most defining characteristics is his unwavering loyalty to his family. Despite the Hewitt family being a constant source of abuse and violence, Leatherface seems deeply attached to them. His loyalty to his relatives makes him a key figure in the horrors they commit, as he generally acts as a protector of his family members or as an enforcer of their will. This loyalty, however, is complex. At times, it seems to be driven more by fear of the family than by genuine love. In some of the more recent installments, this relationship is presented in a more ambiguous manner, suggesting that Leatherface has an emotional connection to his family, although not always in a conscious way. At certain moments, he appears more like a guard dog than an active family member, obeying orders and seeking recognition from others. Although Leatherface is a ruthless killer, he has also been portrayed as a character who experiences both physical and emotional pain. His suffering is not limited to physical pain due to his appearance and deformities, but also extends to emotional pain. The film Leatherface, 2017, shows the character in his adolescence facing emotions of rejection and despair, adding a deeper and more human dimension to him. While his pain drives him to make destructive decisions, it also reveals that deep down he has an internal struggle over how to cope with his trauma. Ultimately, Leatherface is, above all, established as a terrifying figure. Unlike many other villains, whose personalities may be based on logic or a specific motivation, Leatherface is defined by pure terror. Often, his motivation is not entirely clear. His presence is, in many ways, arbitrary and chaotic, making him even more frightening. His connection to the chainsaw and the mask is symbolic of his transformation into a force of terror that seeks neither redemption nor meaning, but simply chaos and death. In many aspects, Leatherface never emotionally matures. His behavior often resembles that of a child who reacts with rage and aggression when faced with rejection or threats. His way of dealing with the world is through violence, as he lacks the emotional tools to handle conflicts differently. In the prequels, a younger Leatherface is shown who, despite being physically large and powerful, is highly vulnerable to emotions and situations, making him even more dangerous as he responds with extreme brutality to any perceived threat. Leatherface is extremely strong. His size and build allow him to perform feats of strength that are far beyond those of an average person. In the films, he is often seen lifting and handling heavy objects, such as the chainsaw, which is not only heavy but also dangerous to wield. This strength also enables him to face his victims with inhuman brutality, using his power to subdue and eliminate those he perceives as threats. The chainsaw is Leatherface's most iconic weapon, and his skill in using it is one of his deadliest abilities. Throughout the saga, he is seen handling the chainsaw with surprising precision and efficiency, capable of dismembering his victims in a matter of seconds. His proficiency with the chainsaw is not just a matter of strength, but also of speed, as he can deliver quick and lethal strikes. This mastery of the chainsaw is an integral part of his identity, representing his primitive method of execution. Throughout the films, Leatherface demonstrates incredible resistance to pain. This can be both an advantage and a disadvantage, but what stands out is his ability to continue his mission despite any injuries he sustains. His resilience to physical pain reflects a nature hardened by trauma and abuse. The idea of suffering does not seem to deter him, making him even more terrifying as an enemy, as he is not easily stopped by serious wounds. Although his size and appearance might suggest that he is clumsy or slow, Leatherface is surprisingly agile and fast when necessary. In several films, especially during chase scenes, he exhibits an ability to move quickly through his environment. This agility allows him to catch his victims off guard, often trapping them before they have time to react. Leatherface does not rely solely on his chainsaw and physical strength. He is also cunning in using his surroundings to capture his victims. Living in a rural and isolated area gives him an advantage over those who wander into his territory. His knowledge of the terrain makes him even more dangerous, as he can lead his victims into traps or situations that put them at a disadvantage. Additionally, he often uses his family and home as extensions of his control, making his presence even more terrifying when surrounded by other psychopaths. Although Leatherface is a terrifying character, his psychology and traumas are among his greatest weaknesses. He is often portrayed as a man incapable of properly processing his emotions, making him vulnerable to situations that overwhelm him emotionally. In several films, such as Leatherface, 2017, he is shown to be easily manipulated or overwhelmed by his surroundings and the people around him, especially when facing family conflicts or situations that remind him of his own suffering. One of Leatherface's greatest weaknesses is his emotional dependence on his family, particularly on his mother and other members who manipulate and control him. While Leatherface is a formidable killer in his own right, he is often shown to be vulnerable when separated from his family or when faced with the possibility of losing his place within it. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, 1986, and other installments, his symbiotic relationship with his family is evident, making him vulnerable if that support system collapses. Despite his ability to instill fear and suffering, Leatherface often acts impulsively without thinking too much about the consequences. This lack of reasoning and his erratic behavior can be seen as a weakness, as it puts him in situations where he can be easily trapped or manipulated. Unlike other more calculating villains, Leatherface acts on instinct, which sometimes makes him vulnerable to those who know how to exploit his lack of judgment. Leatherface's mask is more than just a tool. It is a fundamental part of his identity. Throughout the films, it has been shown that losing his mask or having his disfigured face revealed can cause him considerable distress. In Leatherface, 2017, it is explored how this lack of identity, combined with the emotional trauma of being rejected by his own family, makes him a vulnerable figure when deprived of his mask. And well, that's everything we know so far about the killer known as Leatherface. I first learned about him from a friend back when I was in school. He told me about a news report announcing the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. That's when he told me about this character and how the movie was based on a true story. At first, I didn't believe him because it seemed unreal that someone could actually go through something like that. But when I finally understood, it truly changed the way I saw just how far some people in this world can go. But let me know your thoughts in the comments. Did you already know about Leatherface? Do you think such a monstrous and atrocious being could really exist? And finally, if you ever met him, do you think you would live to tell the tale? Share your answers to these questions and your general opinion about Leatherface. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, share it to support the channel, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of my new videos.